And then the desktop takes the rows.
Well, and you want to customize it to your particular situation, but yeah, it's helpful to have something to look at. Yeah, right. I haven't got new cards printed since I moved in January, so it's all my old phone number.
Just to give you a heads up, we are streaming live
Those
right now.
email address. There's a link to the papers and presentations, and under there you get something to the course. Fairly high.
No. It's just my own area.
Well, I'm glad you're doing well and the school's doing well. I went to the Doom and Gloom library session yesterday. Did you go to that one or no? Hey, it wasn't that doom. Well, there was a little bit of doom. Most of it was a lot of stuff that I've already experienced in terms of the squeeze on the library. In our case, the law faculty doesn't control the law library, the main library on campus. So we haven't been squeezed by the law faculty. It's been the main library that's been getting squeezed. Congratulations. That's wonderful. Well, or condolences, whichever the case may be. So who were they reporting to before? Oh, yeah, that sounds familiar. Yeah. Was there some friction between them? Just one. Someone was that's well, that's frustrating on both sides. Hopefully it'll be better for everyone. Challenging. Well, I can do this. Oh. Hopefully it'll work out without too much stress on it. So this is on top.
Yeah.
But you're not doing it.
It's supposed to clear up.
No, we're just trying to. Actually,
Yep. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so hopefully it'll be some sort of plan.
Oh, that's great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Welcome to the AD.
No.
Just,
Stop by room 170. Okay.
well, you can, I guess you can do to a certain.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, he's been in, he said it's live now.
Yeah.
Mic'd up. All right, I just gotta turn it on.
Well, and if you can do a little bit of research to where the outcomes,
Yes.
that would be ideal, then you can say,
Right, that's exactly.
yeah, good.
That's his legal.
Well, it can be a great
Yeah.
hammer to break down barriers. You know, we're doing this, these outcomes. Yeah.
So this is a call to more. So it's really interesting.
Well, and those are, I'm doing a first class in my master's program.
Yeah.
Something really for me. And those are all things that contribute to better learning outcomes, like students knowing what they're doing. Even better if they can sort of influence a little bit. That's knowledge is huge. And getting immediate or quick feedback. When you're in law school, you yeah, it sounds like his heart's in the right place. It's just a matter of giving
Yes.
We're all over the summer.
Yes.
It's going to be exciting.
One way or another, yes.
We'll see you later.
Hi.
Not here to understand aggressive runs on that. And I mean that not from a heart, but from a vendor's perspective. I've never had to see the links on it.
Camera shot.
Right here? Okay. Here to here, sort of. Okay, so, all right, that works. pre-installed relink authenticators and Battlehead and yeah, everything. It's nice because before it would be like red hot at the top of it, and then it's pretty hot, and it just stays hot until it dies 3 hours later. It says it's up to date. I still think it's a bug implementation of Exchange.
I'm watching a show at 12 o'clock, so I think we can get started if that's okay with everybody. Can everybody hear me? Is the mic working? Okay, very good. Well, first of all, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon to spend an hour discussing service level agreements. It may not be the most scintillating of topics, but I think it's an incredibly important one, and I hope that you'll get something out of this talk today. My name is Ramsey Donhill. I'm the Associate Director for Access and Organization at the John Marshall Law School Library here in Chicago. My background is definitely on the legal side rather than the technology side. I practiced law here in Chicago. I was a corporate attorney with one of the large firms and developed a specialty in software licensing and technology agreements. So I've seen a few of these SLAs in practice, some very meaty ones with financial exchanges, but I think the same principles hold through whether you are, entering into a contract for a smaller law school service or whether or not you're entering into a contract with a technology provider to keep your financial exchange up and running. So first things first, what is an SLA? SLA stands for Service Level Agreement. It's a component of a technology services agreement. SLAs are not standalone agreements. They are part of a larger technology services agreement. I think this is a misconception sometimes, but really an SLA should be attached to a main agreement. Typically, they'll be incorporated by reference. There will be a clause in the main technology agreement that says services will be provided in accordance with the service levels set forth on the SLA attached here to as Exhibit A, something like that. It needs to be part of that agreement. So it's ancillary to a main agreement. Sometimes vendors offer SLAs as an add-on for an extra cost. So you may pay a little more money to get some sort of service commitment from the vendor. That's just something to be aware of. And the most basic definition of an SLA is that it's a promise by a vendor to meet a certain level of service over the course of the agreement. So some examples of technology agreements that may have SLAs associated with them. Some of the broad categories of agreements would be anything related to hosting services, cloud computing services, software as a service, network connectivity agreements, tech support and maintenance. Some of the specific examples you might see in a library or a law school context are agreements for your internet connection, website hosting, ILS hosting and maintenance. So by ILS, I mean integrated library service. So for example, at John Marshall, we pay Innovative to host Millennium for us. Course management systems. You may well have an SLA in connection with that agreement, lecture capture, and then server maintenance and support. So some of the hardware maintenance agreements you may see in SLA, particularly with respect to support. So kind of a threshold question is, are these things negotiable? And if not, why are we here? The answer is that often they are. A lot of providers will really work with you. They want your business, and if you demand an SLA, many of them will provide it. I would always say that if it's an agreement where you feel like there should be an SLA, just ask the vendor. If they dig their heels in, that may tell you something. Sometimes SLAs will not be negotiable. The vendor will say, no, we're not going to negotiate it. And I still think it's valuable to understand the SLA and to evaluate it because, as I mentioned before, sometimes these are sold to you for an extra cost. Is the SLA worth the price? You need to be able to understand the SLA to know whether or not it's valuable to you. And if a vendor provides a clearly deficient SLA to you and refuses to negotiate it, that may well signal something. There could be a problem with this provider. They may anticipate a problem. Probe them, ask them, why will you not negotiate this SLA? Because we don't think it meets the mark, and I want to know why. So why have an SLA at all? If you don't have an SLA, your primary remedy is going to be ultimately to litigate a breach of contract action. Litigation is very costly. Litigation takes a long time, and it has significant delay associated with it. First off, you have to prove a breach of contract. That may be ambiguous. If the agreement simply says they'll provide service X, and you think they're not providing it, they think they are, you'll have a dispute over it. You'll pay lawyers a lot of money to settle it. You also have to establish damages. That can be hard to do. If your course management system goes down for 2 days, what is that worth? It's hard to put a value on some of these services, particularly in a law school context. Also, underlying contracts, the underlying technology agreements may have disclaimers of warranties. They may have limitation of liability clauses. All of these can undercut your ability to enforce the agreement against the provider and recoup any kind of monetary damages. I would argue that in the law school context, the cost of litigation is almost always going to outweigh the benefit, particularly with respect to day-to-day service failures. You've got a slow internet connection, you're not going to litigate that. So effectively, relying on litigation as your remedy, it's not going to get you anywhere. It's not going to motivate the provider to provide good service, so that's where the SLA comes into play. Unless your institution maintains a sizable war chest to litigate things on principle, but I've never had the benefit of working at one of those institutions. I suppose there could be very high dollar contracts where litigation might make sense. If you're operating the New York Stock Exchange, you make money based on trade volume. Your service goes down for half a day, you can roughly approximate your lost revenue. That may be worth litigating because it may be worth that much money. But in the law school context, it's hard for me to envision a situation where litigation would be worth the cost. It would have to be a very dire failure. And in any event, you really want a service that's reliable day to day. You don't want to see these minor degradations in service. That's where the SLA provides you some protection. So the benefits of an SLA are that it hopefully, clearly, and objectively defines what a breach of the agreement is. It sets out what the service level is. For instance, uptime is a very common metric. If the provider fails to meet the uptime level over a given period of time, they're in breach. The SLA should also define remedies and damages. Assuming there is a breach, what do you get back? And typically you'll see some sort of service credit, perhaps a refund of fees, something to that effect. The benefit of the SLA is that it makes this immediate. And immediacy and certainty will ultimately incentivize the provider to provide good service day to day. So that's sort of the framework for why an SLA is important. Now, I'm a former corporate attorney, so I have perhaps a overblown faith in the ability of good contractual drafting to solve the world's problems. I don't want to overstate the case because service providers have incentives other than SLAs to provide good service. Their reputation is a key one. Most providers want to grow their business. They want to get more customers. They don't want the word to get out their service breaks down, that it's undependable, etc. They're also going to want you to be happy with them. So they will want you to renew at the end of the term. So most service providers do have incentives other than the SLA to provide good service. That being said, you may have a great relationship with a service provider right now. You may love your technical support rep, very responsive, excellent. Well, that person could move to another company and you could get a new tech support rep who is not responsive and is not very good. The company that provides the service might undergo a change in ownership, and the new owner may want to cut costs, and that could lead to service degradation. If you have an SLA in place, that should, in theory, establish some consistency in the level of service that you receive. So I'm hesitant to rely exclusively on reputational constraints to incentivize good service. I do think a contractual backup is nice to have. So let's talk about, the way I'm structuring this talk is I'm going to go through the structure of an SLA, the core components as I see them, and then I'll talk about each of them in a little more detail. But just to get out the framework, the bones of an SLA are, first you establish what aspect of the service is being measured. The big ones are service availability, uptime is the metric you'll see there, performance of the service or system, and then technical support for the service or system. How is this going to be measured? That's where metrics will come into play. Hopefully these are objective and clear so that there's no ambiguity as to when the provider fails to meet them. And then finally, the remedy. If you don't have a remedy built into the SLA, it really has no teeth. The remedy is what incentivizes the provider to provide good service day in and day out. They don't want to pay money. And service credits is the most common remedy under an SLA. So before I talk about each of those components of the SLA in greater detail, first things first. The SLA needs to be part of the signed contract. As I mentioned before, an SLA goes together with a technology services contract. A lot of times, you'll have a provider show up with a sheet of paper and say, hey, here's our SLA. No signature blocks, no reference to it in the main contract. So it's really outside of the contract. And if it's a standalone document, you could have trouble enforcing it if it came to that. What I worry about in those situations is the provider saying after the fact, well, that wasn't part of the contract because it was just a target. It wasn't a guarantee. If you want it to be a contractually enforceable guarantee of a certain level of service, it needs to be incorporated into the agreement. Sometimes you'll actually see the language of the SLA written into the main body of the technology agreement. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it gets a little unwieldy to put a full SLA in the main body. So it's more common to see them attached as exhibits to the main agreement. But in some way, shape, or form, it needs to be incorporated into that agreement and made a part of it. Enforcing a standalone document would be difficult. You remember the parole evidence rule from contracts class? The court's going to look at the four corners of the document to decide what the intent of the parties is, and they'll only look outside of it if there's an ambiguity. I'm not saying that you couldn't enforce an SLA against a provider in that context. It's just going to take time and money. Again, you're back to litigation. So just bring the thing into the contract. Another thing you might see is incorporation of the provider's then current service levels into the contract. And usually that will be with reference to an SLA that's posted on a website. I take issue with this because it implies that the provider can, if it's then current, it implies that the provider can modify that document at will. And one thing I would suggest avoiding is any situation where an SLA can be modified unilaterally by the service provider. That makes it a pretty hollow guarantee. They experience some problems, they reduce their SLA, suddenly you're no longer able to recoup any credits or anything like that. And generally speaking, you want to take a look at the modification clause in the technology services agreement as a whole. You don't want any situation where the provider can unilaterally modify the agreement. That's an important clause to look at. So sometimes you'll see we reserve the right to change the terms of this SLA. Oftentimes we'll say upon notice to the service recipient, but full stop, there's nothing you can do about it. Occasionally you'll have a right to terminate if you don't like the terms of the modified SLA, but then you're stuck with scrambling and trying to find a new provider. It's better to just have an agreement be an agreement and have it be static throughout the course of the contract, renegotiated at renewal if need be. Okay, so we'll talk now about the services and the metrics of the SLA. So the first aspect of a service that should be measured under an SLA is the availability of the service or the system. And the principal metric here is uptime. This is probably the most common metric. This and the tech support metrics are probably the most common metrics you'll see in SLAs. Uptime. So for example, a provider might guarantee to provide 99.9% uptime, 365 days a year, 24 hours, 7 days a week. Uptime would typically be measured over a given time period, so uptime percentage over a given month. If they fail to meet that average in a given month, you would be able to recoup some sort of credit depending on the remedy provisions of the SLA. But the real concern with uptime is how is it calculated. 99.9% is great, but if the provider can exclude a lot of downtime from the calculation, that hollows out that guarantee. So the real work here, I think, is in the exclusions. This is what you need to review carefully, and it's what the provider kind of sneaks into the fine print, I feel like. And the first thing I'll talk about is scheduled maintenance. Scheduled maintenance, I think, is properly excluded from an uptime calculation. Every provider is going to need to do some routine maintenance at some point. The key is it has to be done in a way that's convenient to you, the service recipient. So you might want to put some parameters on it. Hours per month. You can do no more than 4 hours of scheduled maintenance per month. Advance notice. You have to give us a week, 2 weeks notice so that we can get the word out to our users that the service will be down for this block of time, some sort of advance notice. And then you might want to consider some broader limitations on when maintenance can be scheduled. If you're operating a stock exchange, you are not going to want scheduled maintenance to happen at noon on a trading day. That's just not going to be acceptable. Similarly, at a law school, you don't want any scheduled maintenance on your exams software during the finals period or on your course management system during finals period. So you might want to think about having peak times or key times when scheduled maintenance cannot be scheduled. The next exclusion is emergency maintenance and unplanned downtime. I would actually argue that emergency maintenance and unplanned downtime should not be excluded from the calculation of uptime. What are you paying for? If they can exclude unplanned downtime, what is the 99.9% getting you? Nonetheless, you will see contracts that try to do that. For mission critical services, I would recommend looking at the provider's plan to minimize unplanned downtime. Do they have proper redundancies, multiple routers, secondary servers, backup power supplies? Do they have everything in place that makes unplanned downtime unlikely? I would look closely at that for any of your mission critical services. Okay, so the last exclusion from the calculation of service availability that I will mention is force majeure. Traditionally, force majeure events are big things that are completely unexpected, completely out of the control of either of the parties. Acts of God is one you see. I'm not sure what that is, but there you have it. Zeus is standing on Mount Olympus and hucks a thunderbolt at your server, then you would cut some slack for that. War, natural disasters, earthquakes, labor strikes is one you would commonly see. So these are, I think, the traditional force majeure events are proper exclusions from the calculation of downtime. Really, nobody can do anything about it. It's not the provider's fault. But read it carefully, because force majeure events are now defined in many contracts very broadly, and they're moving into things that I would argue are not completely out of the provider's control. I'll show you an example of one of those clauses here in a minute. Yeah?
You mentioned labor strikes. I mean, is that typically accepted as an exclusion? It seems like that would be a bit of the fault of the vendor for not having
Negotiating the contract, right?
Yeah.
You do see it commonly. And I guess in the technology space, there aren't a ton of union workers, so it's never a big issue. I don't get worked up over it when I see it in there. But yes, it could be an issue if you're dealing with the unionized workforce.
What do you see for the definition of force majeure? Are we talking about states of emergency declared by the governor, or what are they using for that?
It's more vague than that.
Okay.
You know, it's things like war. I'll show you a clause in just one moment, but you want to be concerned about the breadth of the definition. You also want to be concerned about some mitigation obligation on the provider. Okay, so the call center workers of Iowa have risen up in solidarity and walked off the job. You can't rely on that forever. At some point, you're going to have to get some stalwart, non-union North Dakotans to pick up the phone. So there should be some sort of mitigation obligation on the provider. So here's an example of one of these clauses that some of which I dislike. So when you start talking about failure or delays in communication or utilities, failures or substitutions of equipment, these start sounding like things to me that the provider should have a little more control over. Other technical failures, that seems pretty broad. So, you know, if they fail to purchase enough bandwidth and the service goes down, okay, yeah, they were contracting for that, but I feel like that's within their control. This clause is too broad. I would mark this up seriously and pare it down to stuff that's legitimately outside the control of the provider. But you can see some of the key things: labor disputes, shortages of labor, fuel, and raw materials. They're getting very broad in these definitions, so it's something to look at. Another thing to note is that the force majeure clause will typically be in the main body of the contract, not in the SLA document. So that's something you need to look back at in the main body of the document if you're reviewing your own contracts. So all in all, exclusions from the calculation are of critical importance in looking at the validity of an uptime percentage. 99.9% uptime is not going to do you any good if most downtime is excluded from the calculation. You really want to limit that off. This is an example of how the calculation might be done. Sometimes in SLAs you'll actually see equations like this that really spell out how to calculate service availability. They'll define the various parameters. Some of them are more vague. It'll just be a paragraph that says 99.9% uptime, exclusions for scheduled maintenance, etc. But I just wanted to show you this because you may see this at some point. And the math is not that hard. You just plug a couple numbers in and it's... Okay, so the next service and metric that I want to talk about is system or service performance. The system or service is up, that's great, it's available, but performance is another aspect of it. You want to make sure it's fast enough for you. And the metrics here, the first one is response time. And one of the terms you may see in the contracts is latency. Latency is simply the time it takes for a packet of data to travel from one point to another. So oftentimes you'll see SLAs that impose an average latency over a given month of less than or equal to X seconds or milliseconds, depending on the nature of the service. Another term I've seen in contracts is the average host round trip time, X seconds or less. Generally speaking, this is from the time you push enter until the time you get a response from the service. How long does that take? And another aspect of it that may come into play is time to download information. So response time is one measure of system performance. Another is consistency. And here I would say be wary of averages. If you've got an SLA that provides for an average latency of less than 2 seconds, let's say, that's all well and good, but if your system is incredibly slow during your peak times, but super fast during your off-peak times, and they're still meeting that average latency, that's a problem. You want it to be, the service to be consistent. So be wary of an average latency. And the term you may see here is jitter. Jitter is simply variations in latency. So it's a measure of consistency, and it limits fluctuations in latency to a stated maximum. So the SLA may something like maximum jitter of X milliseconds, something to that effect. You just have to take a look at the service and see what you can tolerate. The last performance metric I want to talk about is packet loss. Packet loss is simply data fails to reach its destination. And the metric will commonly be less than a certain percentage of total packets over a given month or a given time period. And it's important to remember that different data transfers will tolerate different packet loss. So if you're talking about text transfers, packet loss equates to lost content. If you're talking about a voice over IP connection or a video conferencing connection, you can tolerate a bit of packet loss. You don't want it to get below a certain point where the connection is really degraded, but you don't have to have 100% packet loss, 100% or 0% packet loss there. So this is just another metric. You want to make sure information's getting from point A to point B as it should. So providers will often build into the SLA certain assumptions, and these assumptions underlie the service levels, and if the assumptions are not met or exceeded, the provider won't be responsible for failing to meet the service targets under the SLA. So typically, These are volume and transaction-based assumptions. So in a financial exchange context, we commonly see an assumption based on a maximum number of orders per second or orders per trading day. You could also see something with system queries, the number of queries in a given time period, or data transfers, size of files being transferred back and forth. I would recommend taking a close look at any provider assumptions in the SLA and making sure that your institution's use of the service is not going to exceed those assumptions, because it does undercut your protection if you exceed them. If this is a new service and you're starting small and you intend to scale it up possibly, and the provider is imposing assumptions, you could build a provision into the SLA that provides for some expansion of the assumptions over time, perhaps for added cost, but that's something to be attuned to if you see the service as something that's going to grow within your institution during the term of the contract. You might want an expansion clause in there, and at least work that out with the provider ahead of time. Another thing to think about, particularly with respect to service availability, uptime, and the service performance metrics, is who's keeping track of this and who's calculating it. If you can do it, that's optimal, I would say, because you will probably capture it in your favor. But sometimes you're dependent on the provider to make the calculations. And if that's the case, you may want some right to audit their calculation to see how they derived it. But somebody needs to keep track of the calculations, or else you're going to have a hard time ever claiming that the service was degraded and that you're entitled to a credit under the SLA. So the last set of service and metrics that I'm going to talk about, I think this is, together with service availability and uptime, I think this is probably the most common one to see is technical support. Okay, the system went down, what now? First of all, there has to be some type of mechanism for reporting the incident to the service provider, the most common of which are help desk or phone support, perhaps an online ticketing system. We're seeing more and more of the online ticketing systems.
I'm guessing you wouldn't want that for your ISD contract.
Probably not. So if it is a call-based support system, sometimes you'll want to impose some quality measures on the call experience. You might want to have a requirement that they have an English-speaking technician. If your technicians are English-speaking, you might want to put maximum hold times on calls. You also want to establish whether or not it's going to be a live call or an automated calling system. So quality measures are something to think about in terms of establishing a reporting mechanism. You don't want to be on hold for 2 hours. Yeah?
Are you seeing problems with support available times on a couple of our vendors? We've recently been surprised that they don't have anybody on the weekend to support some of our users, or even past a certain time at night when we always thought that they were there. And I don't know if that's becoming more of a trend because costs are being cut. It's been a frustration.
It could well be. That is something that you should have spelled out in the agreement. When will support be available? Is it just during business hours? Is it 24/7? And again, this is something where you need to look at the role of the service in your institution. If it's mission critical, you're going to want 365, 24/7 support available. If it's something that you can live without for a couple of days, maybe having support available during business hours is appropriate. Also look at the time zones. I've seen contracts with foreign companies, and the call support is during their time zone. One of them was in New Zealand. So that's just something to look out for. Okay, so after you've established some sort of call quality measures, the real SLA measures for technical support are response time After you report an incident, how quickly does the provider respond to it? And then time to resolution. So once they start working on it, how quickly will the problem be fixed? So response time. Response times are typically pegged to severity levels of the incident in the SLA. So you will see for a critical incident, you will typically see a faster response time. For a less mission critical incident, just some slightly degraded service, not a huge deal, that'll be rated a lower severity level, and there will be the provider will have more leeway to respond to it. It might be 8 hours instead of 15 minutes, something to that effect. It's important to look at how the severity levels are defined. I've seen critical severity levels defined in terms of impact on the business as a whole. Typically, I would prefer to see a severity level defined with respect to the service itself. So, for example, if you're negotiating a contract for lecture capture software and they define critical severity as business shutdown, well, lecture capture goes down completely. Is your dean going to close the doors and send everybody home? No, it's never going to happen. So you're never going to have a critical severity incident with lecture capture if that's how critical severity is defined. I would prefer to see a definition to the extent of the service is unusable. So define the severity levels in terms of the service, not in terms of impact to the organization. Another key question is who assigns the severity level? Do you assign it, or does the provider assign it? I'm actually sympathetic to the providers here. I would be a little hesitant to give customers free rein to assign severity levels, because you'll invariably have that one customer who everything's a crisis. So typically there needs to be some sort of, one person assigns it, the other has a right to review it and dispute it, and then there could be some sort of dispute resolution procedure to arrive at a final severity level. So time to resolution, and it could also be the time until the provider arrives at a workaround that allows the service to be usable. These times are also often tied to severity levels. And some things to look at are, when does the provider have to begin work on a problem? If it's a critical severity incident, you will probably, for a mission critical service, you will probably want them to have an obligation to immediately begin working to correct the problem. What resources have to be devoted to correcting the problem? So again, for mission critical services, critical severity incidents, you'll perhaps want dedicated personnel working on the problem. You may want an obligation for the provider to work continuously until the issue is resolved or a workaround is put in place. You also may want to think about whether or not you need to obligate the provider to come on site to your institution. They're definitely going to prefer to work from afar, but if they have to get on site, you want that built into the contract. So if it's a server maintenance agreement or something like that, something where somebody needs to show up with a part and install it, I would make it clear that they need to come on site to deal with the issue. And then finally, when will the problem be resolved? A specific number of hours, that would be great if you can get a provider to agree to it. But vendors are obviously hesitant to commit to resolving problems within a certain time frame. It's just too indeterminate for them. So some vendors will agree to a level of commitment, a level of resources. They'll agree to work continuously, but they won't say that we're going to fix all critical severity problems within 2 hours. They just don't feel like they can do it. I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, but if you can get hard and fast times to resolution, I would recommend it. If for no other reason it makes it easier to get a service credit should they fail to meet that resolution time. Okay, so this is an example of what a severity level response time and resolution time grid might look like. And again, this is not a recommendation of any sort, it's just purely illustrative. But you might see, severity level 1, top level severity, they're going to respond in 15 minutes. They're going to immediately assign a dedicated technician and work continuously until it's resolved. That resolution will happen in 2 hours or less. The idea being that if they fail to resolve it in 2 hours or less, they'll begin racking up service credits for each hour they go past that time. Again, hard and fast times, hard to get sometimes. And then you can see severity 2 and severity 3 are less significant problems with the service, so they've got a little more time to work on it. But that's just an example of how a grid might be set up in an SLA. And I will post these slides. I haven't done so yet, but I will get them up if you want to take a look at these. Okay, so the last thing that an SLA needs to have is a remedy. And this is where I see a lot of SLAs coming up short. They'll set out these great service targets, but you get nothing for it if they fail to meet them. So like I said, certainty plus immediacy should incentivize the provider to provide good service. So you've got a certain service level, you've got an immediate remedy, that should motivate the provider. The most common remedy in an SLA is the service credit. And this is a monetary remedy. It's, for example, if you fail to meet your 99.9% uptime, you'll be entitled to some sort of credit against your next month's fees. It should be objective. So a lot of times you'll see a sliding scale in uptime calculations. If you 99.5 to 99.8% uptime, you'll have a certain dollar penalty. 99.0 to 99.4%, you'll have a bigger dollar penalty, and so forth. That's the kind of thing you would look for here with service credits. In the context of tech support, if the provider is obligated to resolve a critical issue within 2 hours and it takes them 6, the SLA should say you're going to get X number of dollars per hour that they go past that resolution time. So it needs to be objective, and if it's clear and objective, then it should incentivize the provider. Now with some providers, it's probably unrealistic to look at the service credit as a way of making you whole. A lot of these contracts simply are not very high dollar contracts. Profit margins of the providers are pretty slim. In those situations, you should really look at causing the provider some pain, cutting into their profit margins. That'll make them nervous. That should incentivize good service. It's not realistic to be made whole in every context. In part because it's hard to calculate what your damages really are. How could you be made whole? Again, 2 days without CMS, or without your content management system or course management system, what's that worth? It's hard to say. Easier if you're a financial exchange, you lost half a day's trading volume, you can say, well, my damages are probably this. A lot harder in a law school context. So look at the remedy as a way to kind of wrap the knuckles of the provider and make them do better going forward. Sometimes service credits just aren't going to get it done. The provider just keeps dropping the ball. They're clearly not getting their act together. And you just need to cut your losses and back out of the contract. So I like having a termination right built into the SLA. If they have chronic failures to meet the service levels, you have a right to pull out of the agreement, get a refund of fees, whatever the case may be. Typically, these will be structured as sort of, 3 service failures in 2 months, or whatever it could be, 2 service failures in a 3-month period. then you would have a right to terminate the agreement. If you're looking at a termination right, you might want to consider transition services. You might want the provider to have to help you transition to a new service provider, just to make the process cleaner and less disruptive to you and your users. So just to recap, I think that it's a fairly simple framework to look at SLAs, and I think it's important to evaluate each of these aspects of them. So is it part of the agreement, part of the binding agreement? Make sure they can't modify it unilaterally. Structurally, what aspect of the service is being measured? Availability, we talked about, uptime, performance, latency and jitter, and packet loss, technical support, what response time are they obligated to meet, what time to resolution, what efforts do they have to devote to fixing the problem. Those are the metrics. They need to be objective, clear to all the parties involved. And then the remedy needs to be clear and objective as well. And service credits are the most common there, termination rights if things get really bad. But that is how I look at service level agreements, and that's sort of the framework I use to evaluate them. So I hope that you find this helpful. I think these are very important agreements. Again, it's very much fine print stuff. Maybe not the most exciting, but it can make a big difference to your institution if you have problems with a service provider and you need to rely on. Does anyone have any questions?
We have an on-campus provider, just internal, and I've never seen the paperwork. I wouldn't be in a position to be privy to that. But instead of like a resolution time, they guarantee a time between contact.
Okay.
They say we will give you a status update.
Keep you updated.
36 hours on any given ticket above this priority.
Mm-hmm.
What are your feelings on that? Is that kind of a dodge?
I think it is.
A way to put you off?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to know what the status is and not be left hanging indefinitely, but again, ultimately, you want the service to work.
Right.
And if their only obligation is to
Tell you
what they're doing, that's great, but it doesn't mean the service is going to be working. Yeah.
On the same token, a response to say, yes, it's fixed, is sometimes important.
Mm-hmm.
You have situations where you as the person that posts the ticket may not know, you're not a user, so you don't know if it's actually addressed.
Yeah.
That's when you come back and with our own IT. How do you know when you're done anything?
Yeah, communication lines are very important, and most technology services agreements, if they're well drafted, would have provisions for assigning a tech contact and some sort of communication channel between the provider and the service recipient. That is important.
Yeah, I don't let my techs close a ticket without getting the okay from the customer. So we have to have an actual verbal, yes, it's fixed from whoever called
From whoever called
it.
it in. Mm-hmm. Do they get to completely define that themselves, or?
It'll be, are you satisfied with this, with anything else we can help with? And if there's something further that's not in the same ticket, we'll open a new one.
Okay.
But it's not going to be, you have two issues. You have the people who want constant help, and then there's people who, when it's supposed to be done, they don't want to talk to you anymore.
Right.
So you've made 40 attempts of contact. So we also have things with that too, where it'll be after like 3 attempts of contact of, hey, we think it's fixed, but can you verify it? And if they ignore it, our third contact will say, okay, well, this is fixed. We'll close the ticket by Friday. We won't hear from you. If you still have problems, let us know.
Yeah, and that's probably appropriate if they don't get back to you at some point. You have to close it out.
Yeah.
June.
I was just going to add, Ramsey and I, we've been looking at a lot of these, and what surprises me is how many of these contracts come, and it's literally like a 1 or 2 page contract, and you think, oh, I can just sign this, and I know a lot of IT people who do. And you have to take that step and ask for the SLA, because they never, it's so rare that they've actually ever provided it to us. We actually have to go out and ask for it, so that's something I would highly recommend, is you always ask. And again, what he was saying, a lot of times they'll just say, oh yeah, it's online, just go look here. And we don't accept that. So, they'll try to put you off, and so don't just buy into it. And The other thing I was gonna say is, I know this looks like a lot of work, and it is, and Ramsey's wonderful to put up with it, but, a lot of it is, it's about trade-offs. So for what we're always looking at is, Ramsey will come back and say, okay, June, we've got all these clauses and they're really horrendous. And what do we do? So, you have to take into calculation, how much time do we have between right now and when we need this service? That's one. And if the answer is we need it yesterday, we'll probably just let it slide, depending on how important that thing is, right? So again, if it's our CMS, you bet we're going to spend months looking at this thing, and we did. We hammered. Our CMS is sort of hosted by Moodle Rooms, and we hammered Moodle Rooms. We actually went through three attorneys because they kept switching. People. But we hammered them, and in the end, it was great because if we did have problems, and we could go back and say, we have this little thing called right determination, and you are really treading on the edge here. So, and they responded. So, I can't even begin to tell you how important this kind of negotiation is. And I know a lot of you have university general counsels and stuff, and that's great, but, honestly, you're the one who has to live with this. So make sure you look at it because, whatever they agree to, you're going to be stuck with it. And you're going to be held responsible for fails. So, take the time. Make sure you learn what's in these things.
University counsel is invariably too far removed from the situation to understand what a proper SLA is in that situation. Unless they're getting on the phone with the technical folks and really talking it through with them. That's not my impression of how most university GC offices work. But I think that the people on the ground need to look at it. And that's why I think it's important for non-lawyers to be able to read these things and understand what they're signing on for. And ask for the SLA very early in the process. Another vendor strategy is to slide it to you a day before the contract, quote unquote, has to be signed. And then they just bank on the fact that you'll throw your hands up and just sign over any objections. So ask early on.
Have you seen any examples, actually going on your question, of interdepartmental or inter-service within the universities negotiating these kind of things, especially in the sort of chargeback fee-for-service kind of model that we're going into?
Not at our institution. So you're talking about agreements between departments in an institution?
Yeah.
I mean, that gets a little more difficult because the money's all coming out of the same pot at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But you do want, good service, and it may be appropriate to have some service levels associated with the service, at least some targets that you can rely on and say, look, this department's really dropping the ball with respect to this aspect of our service. So, but I'd be hard pressed to think that you're going to have a formal SLA structure with a monetary remedy, and obviously.
Well, I mean, some things we actually are paying them out of our budget. And
So you
become part of their
credit
budget.
back for the amount you paid them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be appropriate.
I have a question. Referring to your experience with Moodle Room, anything happened to like do you have a wow moment and say, oh yeah, I'm really glad I did that? Did anything happen with any of the SLA agreements?
It happens every once in a while. I mean, and I should say, we love Moodle Rooms. I mean, I don't want to bash them at all. They've been great. But I think one of the biggest problems we've had is the prioritization of your ticket. So, we think it's really vital because, I don't know, nobody's doing anything because it's dead. But they've determined that it's not mission critical for us, and they've dropped it from high to medium, or even low sometimes. And so we spend a lot of time calling back, fighting, because, and the great thing is because Ramsey's done a great job on the SLA, we have a lot more teeth. And like for example, the termination thing is a great example because we're not afraid of termination because Ramsey's built into this thing where they have to help us transition. So, not only can we terminate and feel okay that they're required to help us transition to another service, that gives us a lot more strength. Because otherwise, if you just terminate, you're dead in the water. So you gotta make sure you get every single piece in there because it's so important, because it's completely useless otherwise.
Yeah, transition services are critical. You should probably think about that in every technology service agreement that you have. Because invariably, if you're going to migrate the services over, you want it to be done with a minimum of disruption. Otherwise, you're just not going to do it.
Try that in innovative license.
We got it, actually. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. I know that. Thanks for sticking it out to the bitter end, and I hope you've enjoyed your time in Chicago. Like I said, I will post the slides, so you can look through them there too.
We have a bunch of but also kind of not part of the school.
We always have
Relationship and do it more for
they never get it.
tends to go ahead and either expect
That's why you gotta ask.
or so it makes it super helpful.
Oh, really?
You are going to have to and we're not. We're out. We're going to stop supporting.
We never have.
So it's
We call them.
in our best interest to have
You know,
them
as
share.
far as their service goes, we have, I think we're
Yeah.
This is what I'm doing.
Write it in the
Yeah.
and never negotiate contracts. It's always been through the
They don't do enough.
I know it's been through
Yeah.
the contract. Negotiated.
Yeah.
Oh, you did?
That one wasn't
Yeah. No, yeah, we actually, it's so funny. It's probably not really a SLA, but we also have things like that with our marketing department.
I can switch this thing off.
And it's usually because something bad has happened, so you have to put in place like, okay, if someone realizes the website isn't working at 4 a.m., which is 3 director you could call, and it's kind of funny, like who's on duty? Yeah, and it's super awkward too because like some of our services, obviously are ours and the EA, but some are like the central institutions, like sometimes they just won't talk to us.
Yes, well, we have, I don't know, maybe it was explained to you or somebody else, there's a person that each campus or business unit is supposed to go through the central ITS. It's called the ITS consultant.
Oh, okay.
We had an awesome one. He retired, and now we have this guy who I've never met, never seen, never talked to.
Oh,
He left me one voicemail 3 months ago, and I never heard from him again in almost all of that. Pisses me off. But we're supposed to go through them whenever we're dealing, when we're supposed to negotiate with other technical units within ITS about changes to the things that we want to do.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm supposed to go through you, why aren't you available? Why don't you respond?
That's what it's like. I'll
Everybody
just tell
else
you
that
what
I've
I'm
heard,
doing.
that's funny because other people have said the same thing about the same guy. I asked, well, what does he do all day?
I actually understand it, it's institutional policy kind of thing. Which probably we've all been relying on for a long time. But we're getting into a model where it's a charge for services or a charge back
Yeah, and that's what we.
internally.
Yeah,
So like if
exactly.
we use UITS services, we're getting charged back.
Yeah, no, we do too.
So we're actually paying into their budget
So they-
for this person to exist.
So what's the?
What's the remedy when, which is
Yes.
3 weeks before you get an answer?
Yeah.
Thankfully, I mean, at least with the networking services group, they have an operations center and we can go through them for that. So in this particular case, like, I want to start a new thing, and I can't get the process started because
Can't get the guy
I
on
can't
the
get the guy on the
Yeah, that's shitty.
phone. It is. It really frustrates me. So I just went to some other contact and I got the name from the manager who goes, the solution I want.
What are you guys using to stream?
Yeah, we streamed it.
No, I'm asking, what are you guys using for that?
Oh, it's hold on, I'll tell you the exact name of the program. It's Wirecast.
Oh, you guys using Wildcats?
Yeah.
We use live stream, I'm trying to figure out if it's better off.